Hey folks, thanks for joining me for part 3 of our Azure Administrator Exam Practice Question Series. Today we will go through 20 more questions that resemble the type of content you will likely encounter in the Azure Administrator exam. Before we dive into the questions, if you are interested in getting the PDF file with the full set of questions, feel free to join the channel as a gold member. Just email me at devopshub2023@gmail.com with your membership confirmation to receive your PDF copy.
You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. Subscription 1 contains the resource groups in the following table. Now, in the table, you have 3 resource groups named RG1, RG2, and RG3, and they are hosted in Azure regions, including West Europe, North Europe, France Central, and there are 3 policies named Policy 1, Policy 2, and Policy 3 applied to the respective resource groups. Resource group 1, which is RG1, has a web app named Web App 1. Web App 1 is located in West Europe. You move Web App 1 to RG2. What is the effect of the move? So basically, a resource group contains Web App 1, and this Web App 1 is moved from RG1 to RG2. You need to determine what is the effect of the move on Web App 1. Your options are: the app service plan for Web App 1 moves to North Europe. Policy 1 applies to Web App 1. Option 2, the app service plan for Web App 1 remains in West Europe. Policy 2 applies to Web App 1. Option 3, the app service plan for Web App 1 moves to North Europe. Policy 2 applies to Web App 1. Option 4, the app service plan for Web App 1 remains in West Europe. Policy 1 applies to Web App 1. Now, all these options are a combination of either the location, the region of the Web App 1 is changing, or a different policy is getting applied. Whenever you are dealing with such situations, you need to know that moving a resource only moves it to a new resource group or subscription. It doesn't change the location of the resource. So the app service plan will remain same in West Europe. Based on this statement, you can eliminate option A and option C. Let's now look at which policy will be applied, as that's the second part of the solution. Policy in this case is scoped to resource group. As you can see, RG1 has policy 1, RG2 has policy 2, and RG3 has policy 3. So as soon as you move to a new resource group, the policy corresponding to target resource group will get applied, which means after the move, app service will have policy 2 applied. So the correct answer is option B. The app service plan for Web App 1 remains in West Europe. Policy 2 applies to Web App 1. Let's look at next question of the series. You deploy an Azure Kubernetes service cluster named Cluster 1 that uses the IP addresses shown in the following table. Now, there are 4 IP addresses, and then the assigned to table shows to which section or feature the IP address is applied to. You need to provide internet users with access to the applications that run in Cluster 1. Which IP address should you include in the DNS record for Cluster 1? Your options are 192.168.10.2, 172.17.7.1, 131.107.2.1, 10.0.10.11. Now, here you are trying to expose the application over internet, which means you will need a public IP. Looking at the table, you can easily identify 131.107.2.1 is a public IP. This you can identify based if you have just the basic knowledge of IP addresses. Now, in case you are not a networking person, then also the question has hint in the assigned to section where it says in the first IP, which is the right answer, it says load balancer front end. Front end is usually associated with the endpoint that is used by users to access the application. So even if you don't have the networking knowledge, it doesn't need very advanced networking knowledge. But if you don't have the basic networking knowledge as well, then also you can answer this question just looking at the assigned to section. Let's move to question number 53 of the series. You have an Azure virtual machine named VM1 that runs Windows Server 2019. The VM was deployed using default drive settings. Remember a keyword here, default drive settings. You sign into VM1 as a user named user1 and perform the following actions. The action that you perform are create files on drive C, create files on drive D, modify the screensaver timeout, change the desktop background. You plan to redeploy the VM. Now you want to redeploy the VM. What changes will be lost after you redeploy the VM? So you make some changes to the VM and now you want to redeploy it. And you need to determine which changes will be lost after you redeploy VM. Your options are the new files on drive D, the new desktop background, the modified screensaver timeout, the new files on drive D. After you redeploy a VM, all the data that you saved on the temporary disk or the ephemeral disk is lost. Since the VM is deployed with default settings, that means D drive is the temporary disk here. So files created in D drive will be lost when the VM is redeployed. So the correct answer is option D, new files on drive D. Now, as a note, I would like to tell you that the dynamic IP addresses associated with virtual network interface are also updated when a VM is redeployed. So there can be another part in this question talking about the IP addresses associated with virtual network as well. Let's move to question 54 of the series. You have an Azure storage account named Storage1 that uses Azure Blob Storage and Azure File Storage. You need to use AZ copy to copy data to the blob storage and file storage in Storage1. Which authentication method should you use for each type of storage? To answer, you just need to select the appropriate options in the answer area. Now for blob storage and file storage, you have similar options, and the options are Azure Active Directory only, shared access signatures only, access keys and shared access signature only, Azure AD and shared access signature only, Azure AD, access keys and shared access signatures, which means all three options. So the correct answers are for blob storage, you can use Azure AD and SAS only. And for file storage, you can only use SAS. Now let's look at the detailed explanation. As you can see, here is a screenshot from Microsoft to support the answer where you can clearly see when authorizing AZ copy, then you can use Azure AD and SAS with blob storage, and SAS only authentication is supported for file storage. You can refer to the link on my screen now, which will provide you more details around how you authorize AZ copy and what all authentication methods are available and how they can be configured. Next question. You have an Azure subscription linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. The tenant includes a user account named user1. You need to ensure that user1 can assign a policy to the tenant root management group. What should you do? Your options are assign the global administrator role to user1 and then instruct user1 to configure access management for Azure resources. Create a new management group and delegate user1 as the owner of the new management group. Assign the owner role for the Azure subscription to user1 and then instruct user1 to configure access management for Azure resources. Assign the owner role for the Azure subscription to user1 and then modify the default conditional access policies. So the correct answer in this case is assign the global administrator role to user1 and then instruct user1 to configure access management for Azure resources. Question number 56. You have an Azure subscription that contains a web app named Web App 1. You need to add a custom domain named www.contoso.com to Web App 1. What should you do first? Create a DNS record, upload a certificate, add a connection string, stop Web App 1. The correct answer is option A, create a DNS record. You can either use a CNAME record or an A record to map a custom DNS name to app service. It is recommended to use CNAME for custom domain and A record for root domains. Question number 57. You deploy an Azure Kubernetes service cluster named AKS1. You need to deploy a YAML file to AKS1. Solution you choose is from Azure CLI, you run the kubectl client. Does this meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. Yes, this is the correct solution. To deploy the YAML file, you need to run the below command, which is on your screen. Kubectl apply -f is the parameter, and then whatever is your file name .yaml. Again, there is a link on your screen. Go through this link to understand more about Azure Kubernetes cluster and their deployments. Let's move to question number 58 of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual machine named VM1. VM1 hosts a line of business application that is available 24 hours a day. VM1 has one network interface and one managed disk. VM1 uses the DSv3 size. You plan to make the following changes to VM1. Change the size to DPSv5, add a 500 GB managed disk, add the Puppet agent extension, enable desired state configuration management. Which change will cause downtime for VM1? Now you have a critical line of business application which is used 24/7, and you are making some changes to the application which are mentioned, and you need to determine which of the change will cause downtime. Your options are add the Puppet agent extension, add a 500 GB managed disk, change the size of DPSv5, enable desired state configuration management. Now, changing the size of an Azure virtual machine involves a stop and restart of the virtual machine, which will cause downtime for the critical application hosted on VM1. So the correct answer is option C, change the size to DPSv5. Now, adding a managed disk, installing the Puppet agent extension, or enabling desired state configuration management will not cause any downtime for VM1, so they are not the correct options. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains a Azure Kubernetes service cluster named AKS1. The auto-scaling feature is enabled. You need to configure the minimum and maximum node counts for AKS1. Which commandlet should you use? Your options are set AZ-AKS cluster, start AZ-AKS cluster, update AZ-AKS node pool, set AZ-AKS cluster credential. Now, the set AZ-AKS cluster can be used to set minimum and maximum node counts for the cluster. Node max count parameter is used for setting maximum number of nodes for autoscaling, and node min count is used for setting minimum number of nodes for autoscaling. I have links to both of these parameters so that you can read through them in more detail and understand them on how they can be used in practical scenarios. Now, talking about the questions talking about the answers which are incorrect. The start AZ-AKS cluster is used to start an Azure Kubernetes cluster. Update AZ-AKS node pool is used to update node pool in a managed cluster. And set AZ-AKS cluster credential is used to reset the service principal of an existing AKS cluster. So if this question is reworded and a different functionality is asked, you know 3 options which will help you in answering a different type of question. Let's move to next question of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure container app named Container App 1. You plan to add scaling rules to Container App 1. You need to ensure that Container App 1 replicas are created based on received messages in the Azure Service Bus. Which scale trigger should you use? Your options are HTTP-driven, event-driven, memory usage, and CPU usage. So the correct answer is option B, event-driven. Scaling is driven by three different categories of triggers. It can be a HTTP, which is based on the number of concurrent HTTP requests to your revision. It can be a TCP trigger based on the number of concurrent TCP connections to your revision. And it can be a custom trigger, which can be created based on CPU, memory, or supported event-driven data source, which is what is asked in this question. And the driven sources can be Azure Service Bus, Azure Event Hubs, Apache Kafka, and Redis. In this question, they are talking about Azure Service Bus, but you can see there are different data sources which are supported, which can be Azure Event Hubs or Kafka or Redis. So again, this question can be reworded to a different question, or probably a different source can be used. So it is very important that you remember there are other sources as well that are supported apart from Azure Service Bus. You have an Azure subscription that contains two log analytics workspaces named Workspace 1 and Workspace 2, and 100 virtual machines that run Windows Server. You need to collect performance data and events from the virtual machines. The solution must meet the following requirements. Logs must be sent to Workspace 1 and Workspace 2. All Windows events must be captured. All security events must be captured. What should you install and configure on each virtual machine? Your options are Windows Azure Diagnostic Extension, Azure Monitor Agent, Windows VM Agent. To collect performance data and events from the virtual machines and meet the specified requirements, you should install and configure the Azure Monitor Agent on each virtual machine. The Azure Monitor Agent is responsible for collecting and sending performance data, logs, and events from the virtual machine to Azure Monitor. It supports collecting both Windows events and security events, which is a requirement in this question. You can define a data collection rule to send data from multiple machines to multiple log analytics workspaces. Again, this is a requirement that you need to send logs from both workspaces. And this includes workspaces in different regions or tenants as well. On your screen, you can see a URL, which you can use to understand more about how to create a data collection rule. Now let's look at why other options are not right. The other option, which is Windows Azure Diagnostic Extension, is primarily used for collecting diagnostic data from Azure virtual machines and cloud services. And it is not applicable in this scenario since you are using virtual machines running on Windows Server. The Windows VM agent is responsible for managing and configuring virtual machines in Azure, but does not provide the necessary functionality for collecting and sending performance data and events to Azure Monitor, making it an incorrect choice. Let's look at next question of the series. You have an Azure subscription that uses the public IP addresses shown in the following table. Now the table has three IPs, all are IP version 6, and their SKU is, for first two, it is basic, and the last one is standard. The IP address assignment for IP1 and IP3 is static, and the IP2 is dynamic. When it comes to availability zone, IP1 and IP2 don't have any availability zone applicable, and for IP3, it is zone redundant. Now you need to create a public Azure standard load balancer. Which public IP address can you use? Now the matching SKUs are required for load balancers and public IP resources as per the official Microsoft documentation. Now here you can see load balancer is a standard one, and in the table you can see only IP3 is the one which has standard SKU. So the correct answer is option B, IP3 only. Question number 63 of the series. Your company has a series of virtual machines created as part of their Azure subscription. They want to ensure the IT administrative team is notified if any of the virtual machines go into the deallocated state. Which of the following could you perform to fulfill this requirement? Your options are enable diagnostic logs for the virtual machine, create an alert based on the activity log for the virtual machine, assign a resource tag for the virtual machine, and then create an alert based on that resource tag, create an Azure policy using an inbuilt definition from the compute category. Now, by creating an alert based on the activity log, you can configure a condition to trigger an alert whenever a virtual machine goes into the deallocated space. The activity log records all the management events and operations performed on Azure resources, including the state change of virtual machines, which is what we are trying to capture here, the deallocated state of the virtual machine. As like previous questions, now let's look at why other options are not correct. Enabling diagnostic logs for the virtual machine would provide detailed monitoring and troubleshooting information, but does not specifically address the requirement of notifying the IT administrative team about the deallocated state. Now, option C, assigning a resource tag for the virtual machine and creating an alert based on that resource tag can help with organizing and managing resources, but it doesn't directly capture the state change of the virtual machine. Option D, which is creating an Azure policy using an inbuilt definition from the computer category, helps enforce specific rules and configurations, just like all other Azure policies, but may not provide the real-time notifications for the deallocated state, making it an incorrect choice. Next question. Your company has an Azure subscription that includes a storage account, a resource group, a blob container, and a file share. A colleague named Jim Taylor makes use of a solitary Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a virtual machine and an additional Azure storage account. You want to review the ARM template that was used by Jim Taylor. Solution is you access the virtual machine blade. Does the solution meet the goal? You need to tell yes or no. And no, this solution doesn't meet the goal. Accessing the virtual machine blade would not allow you to review the ARM template that was used by the user Jim Taylor. To review the ARM template used by Jim, you would typically need to access the deployment history or template deployment section within the Azure portal. From there, you can view the deployment history and find the specific deployment made by the user. Within the deployment details, you can access the ARM template that was used for deployment, and you can review its contents as well. Question number 65. Your company has an Azure Active Directory tenant named DevOpsHub2023.com. Company has appointed user 1 to review all the settings of the tenant. As an admin, your job is to ensure that user 1 can review all the settings of the tenant. However, user 1 must be prevented from changing any settings. Which role should you assign to user 1? Your options are security reader, directory reader, global reader, and reports reader. And the correct answer in this case is option C, global reader. When you grant global reader role to the user, they can read everything that a global administrator can, but not update anything, making it a correct choice in this case. Next question. You have an Azure Active Directory tenant named contoso.onmicrosoft.com that contains 100 user accounts. You purchase 20 Azure AD Premium P2 licenses for the tenant. You need to ensure that 20 users can use all the Azure AD Premium features. What should you do? Your options are from the license blade of Azure AD, assign a license. From the directory role blade of each user, modify the directory role. From the Azure AD domain, add an enterprise application. From the groups blade of each user, invite the users to a group. And the correct answer in this case is from the license plate of Azure AD, assign a license. Now, by assigning the Azure AD Premium P2 licenses to specific users from the license plate of Azure AD, you can grant them access to all the features and capabilities offered by Azure AD Premium. This action allows you to assign the licenses directly to the 20 users who need the premium feature. Question number 67. You have a sync group named sync1 that has a cloud endpoint. The cloud endpoint includes a file named file1.txt. Your on-premise network contains servers that run Windows Server 2019. The servers are configured as shown in the following table. Now you have two servers who have shares with the name of share1 and share2, and share1 contains file1.txt and file2.txt, and share2 contains file2.txt and file3.txt. You add share1 as an endpoint for sync1. 1 hour later, you add share2 as an endpoint for sync1. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Now you will get a bunch of statements which you need to tell whether they are right or wrong based on the scenario explained in the question. Now the first statement is on the cloud endpoint, file1.txt is overwritten by file1.txt from share1. Now you can see the cloud endpoint already has a file named file1.txt, and share1, which is mapped, also has a file named file1.txt. So the question or a statement is on the cloud endpoint, file1.txt is overwritten by file1.txt from share1. No. When you add share1 as an endpoint for sync1, it does not automatically override any files on the cloud endpoint. The initial synchronization process will compare the files in share1 and the cloud endpoint and ensure that they are in sync. So they don't get overridden by default. Now the next statement is on server 1, file1.txt is overwritten by file1.txt from cloud endpoint. Again, no. When you add share1 and share2 as endpoints for sync1, it does not automatically override any files on the on-premise servers like server 1. The initial synchronization process will compare the files in the cloud endpoint and on-premise servers and ensure they are in sync. The statement, the answer to this statement is exactly same as that of the previous statement. There, a different scenario of overwritten was talked about. Here we are talking about a different scenario of overriding files. But the explanation is same. The files will not get override in the initial synchronization process. Let's look at third statement. File1.txt from share1 replicates to share2. Yes, when you add share1 and share2 as endpoints for sync1, the files in share1 will be replicated to share2. Since file1 is included in share1, it will be replicated to share2 as part of the synchronization process. Sync1 ensures that the file in the different endpoints of the sync group are kept in sync. So the statement would be applicable for other files as well. If they are missing from one share, they will get replicated to the other share. Question number 68 of the series. Development team for your project asks you to provision an Azure storage account for their use. To remain in compliance with IT security policy, you need to ensure that the new Azure storage account meets the following requirements. Now, the requirements are data must be encrypted at rest. Access keys must facilitate automatic rotation. The company must manage the access keys. What should you do? Your options are create a service endpoint between the storage account and a virtual network, require secure transfer for the storage account, enable storage service encryption SSE on the storage account, configure the storage account to store its keys in Azure Key Vault. And the correct answer in this case is option D. Configure the storage account to store its keys in Azure Key Vault. Let's look at why other options are not correct. You should not create a service endpoint between the storage account and a VNet. A service endpoint allows you to limit traffic to a storage account from resources residing on the Azure VNet. Now, secure transfer, which is option B, you should not require secure transfer for the storage account. Secure transfer forces all REST API calls to use HTTPS instead of HTTP. This feature has nothing to do with either access keys or their management and rotation. And the third option, you should not enable SSE on the storage account for two reasons. First, SSE is enabled automatically on all Azure storage accounts and encrypts all storage account data at rest. Second, SSE in its native form uses Microsoft managed access key, which violates the scenario constraint for customer managed keys. The third requirement is there should be the company must manage the access keys, which is what we are talking about, customer managed access key. So the correct answer in this case is option D, configure the storage account to store its keys in Azure Key Vault. Let's look at next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains the following resources: 120 Azure virtual machines, 20 Azure SQL databases, 50 Azure file shares. You need to create a daily backup of all the resources by using Azure Backup. What is the minimum number of backup policies that you must create? Now, your options are 1, 2, 3, 150, or 170. The minimum number of backup policies you must create in this case is 2. Now, let's look at why 2. As you can see on my screen, with Azure Backup, you can create a single backup policy that can be applied to multiple resources of the same type. However, a single backup policy can have a maximum of 100 virtual machines. So in this case, since you have 120 Azure virtual machines, which means you will need at least 2 backup policies to accommodate this requirement. If the question had maybe 90 virtual machines, then 1 backup policy would have been enough in that case. So it is very critical that whenever there is some data mentioned in the question, make sure that you are looking at the numbers as well, because they might give you the numbers which are just at the border, which is what is seen in this case. You have an Azure subscription that has a recovery services vault named Vault 1. The subscription contains the virtual machines shown in the following table. VM1, VM2, VM3, and VM4 are the 4 VMs. And the operating systems are Windows 10, Ubuntu Server, Windows Server 2012 R2, and Windows Server 2016. Now, the machines also have an auto shutdown schedule. 2 machines, which are VM1 and VM4, are getting shut down at 8 p.m., whereas the other machines don't have an auto shutdown schedule. You plan to schedule backups to occur every night at 11. Which virtual machines can you back up by using Azure Backup? Now, the options are, the first one is VM1 only, second one is VM1 and VM2, third one is VM1 and VM3, and the fourth one is VM1, VM2, VM3, and VM4. Now, in this case, you should be able to back up all the VMs using Azure Backup. Let's look at detailed explanation for saying why all VMs can be backed up in this case. So in the table, you can see 2 of the VMs are getting auto shutdown at 8. And the first statement which I have there in the explanation says Azure Backup supports backup of VMs that are shut down or offline. So even though you have a shutdown schedule here, it doesn't really matter. It is just there so to confuse you. But even if a VM is shut down, its backup can be taken. Now, the second statement is Azure Backup supports backup of 64-bit Windows Server operating systems from Windows Server 2008. And the 2 VMs, which are VM3 and VM4, are obviously released after Windows Server 2008. So, which pretty much confirms VM3 and VM4 can be backed up. Now, Again, the Azure backup supports Windows 10 operating system as well, which means VM1 can also be backed up. And Azure backup supports Ubuntu operating systems as well, which are above 12.04. And here the Ubuntu server we have is 18.04 LTS. So that can also be backed up, making the option which has all the VMs listed as the correct answer. And there is a link on your screen at the moment, which you can refer to read more about the different metrics that are applicable when you are doing backups using Azure Backup.
Thanks for staying until the end, friends. If you have enjoyed the content, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe the channel. I'll see you in the next part of the series, so make sure to turn on notifications to be informed as soon as the video goes live. And remember, if you have not watched the previous parts yet, then link to them are available in the description section of this video. Make sure to watch them as well to get the maximum out of our content.